The next section that we're going to cover is free radical injury. And the way this fits into the chapter is that we've been talking about cellular injury, and we discussed hypoxia as one of the important causes of cellular injury. And of course, we used hypoxia as a mechanism to teach some of the principles that a cell undergoes when it becomes injured. So we're now going to continue with our discussion of injury. However, instead we're going to focus on free radicals, which can also cause injury. This discussion is relatively high yield, and hence the reason why I've made it a separate sort of subsection in your text. All right, before we can begin our discussion of free radicals, we should take a step back and define what a free radical actually is. So a free radical is a chemical species with an unpaired electron in the outer orbit. And it's this unpaired electron that has the ability to induce damage within the cell. Now, it's important to recognize that free radicals are actually generated physiologically and pathologically. So what do we mean by physiologically? Well, physiologic generation of free radicals occurs during oxidative phosphorylation, and of course this is part of the normal physiology of a human being, so that's why we use the term physiologic. Now let's review oxidative phosphorylation briefly and remind ourselves that during oxidative phosphorylation, cytochrome C oxidase transfers electrons to oxygen as a final electron acceptor. And you recall in our prior discussion of the electron transport chain, oxygen obviously accepts electrons, which then drives the production of drives the production of a proton gradient, which then eventually drives the production of ATP. Now, generally speaking, oxygen will actually accept 4 electrons, and after accepting 4 electrons, water will be generated. And so, if during the sequence of accepting of electrons, oxygen is partially reduced and doesn't receive all 4 electrons, then free radicals can be generated. But in order to understand the free radicals that are generated, we do have to review a little bit of biochemistry. So let's take a moment to just remind ourselves that if this is oxygen here, if oxygen accepts 1 electron, then it becomes something called superoxide. If it accepts 2 electrons, it then becomes hydrogen peroxide. If it accepts 3 electrons, it becomes hydroxyl ion. And if it accepts 4 electrons, it becomes water. And so when I say that physiologic generation of free radicals occurs during oxidative phosphorylation, obviously if there is a partial reduction of oxygen so that it only accepts 1, 2, or 3 electrons instead of the normal 4 electrons, that's going to result in the production of free radicals, and that does happen physiologically. Free radicals can also be generated pathologically. Some important examples: ionizing radiation can generate free radicals, and ionizing radiation, the classic free radical that's generated is actually hydroxyl ion. So OH. And what's important to recall here is that ionizing radiation, the way by which it generates these free radicals is that the radiation actually hits water within tissues, and once it hits water within tissues, one possible consequence of that is the generation of hydroxyl free radical. And we should bear in mind that among all of the free radicals, the hydroxyl free radical is sort of the most damaging, and that's something that examiners like you to know. So again, I'll repeat it. Of all of the free radicals, the hydroxyl free radical is the most damaging. Now, another mechanism by which free radicals can be generated, or are generated actually, is inflammation. Remind ourselves that when neutrophils come in to battle an infection, they have 2 mechanisms of killing the microbe. One is called oxygen dependent, the other is oxygen independent. Remember that the oxygen dependent mechanism starts out, if you go back to biochemistry, the reaction starts out with something called an oxidative burst. And basically what happens there is that oxygen is taken, and oxygen is acted on by an enzyme. And do you remember the name of that enzyme? It's important for biochemistry, high yield for examinations. The enzyme is called NADPH oxidase. And NADPH oxidase takes oxygen and converts it to superoxide. And so that's the very first step. And superoxide will very quickly be converted by superoxide dismutase to hydrogen peroxide. And then hydrogen peroxide is converted by myeloperoxidase to form bleach, or HOCl. But we'll discuss that. We'll discuss the additional reactions later when we do our chapter or section on inflammation. However, what I really want to highlight here is this very first reaction. That first reaction in oxygen-dependent killing generates free radical, and so in particular the superoxide free radical. And so inflammation is another mechanism by which free radicals are formed. A third pathologic mechanism by which free radicals can form is by interaction with metals, for example, copper and iron. And this actually becomes very high yield as well. The reason we have to be familiar with this is because, well, why don't we take a step back? First of all, let's remind ourselves from biochemistry that, generally speaking, copper and iron are usually, whenever present in the body, are usually bound. Just to give you an example, I mean, you're all familiar with the headaches of learning about iron biochemistry and the concept of, ferritin and transferrin and all these molecules that iron gets bound to the moment that it enters the blood. The reason iron is so carefully bound the moment it enters the blood is because if iron is left free, it has the ability to generate free radicals. And the way by which it generates the free radical, there's an important reaction, the name of which you should be aware of. It's called the Fenton reaction. And the Fenton reaction allows for iron to actually generate a free radical, and the free radical that is most commonly generated is hydroxyl free radical. And again, hydroxyl free radical is the most dangerous of all of the free radicals. Maybe it'd be easier for you to remember if we just, or at least for an examination, perhaps another important point here, which will help you remember this concept, is we have a couple diseases in which either copper can build up or in which iron can build up. And in both of those diseases, when copper and iron build up, we get various clinical manifestations. Let's just take iron, for example. When iron builds up, we get a disease called hemochromatosis. And you're well aware of the fact that hemochromatosis, it results in tissue damage. For example, it can create cirrhosis in the liver and damage in other tissues. And that's the reason, or the underlying mechanism behind that tissue damage, is actually the fact that that excess iron in the body that's seen in hemochromatosis actually generates free radicals. Another example, I just take an excess of copper. So what's the disease in which there is an excess of copper? It's called Wilson's disease. And in Wilson's disease, the excess of copper generates free radicals, which then leads to tissue damage, creating a certain clinical, a series or set of certain clinical symptoms. So again, it's important to know, and examiners love to go after to ask you, what's the underlying mechanism of damage in hemochromatosis, or what's the underlying mechanism of damage in Wilson's disease? In both cases, it's the pathologic generation of free radicals that actually results in the tissue damage that then produces clinical symptoms. All right, another example of pathologic generation of free radicals are drugs and chemicals. Acetaminophen is a very kind of classic example, especially from pharmacology. Acetaminophen goes to the liver, it gets converted by the P450 system, and free radicals are generated in the process. The free radicals can be damaging to the tissues, and you will have learned, or perhaps have already learned, that high-dose acetaminophen can be taken by a patient who might try to commit suicide, for example, or who may overdose on acetaminophen, and that overdose of acetaminophen causes massive liver necrosis. And the massive liver necrosis is due to the fact that the acetaminophen gets into the liver, the hepatocytes convert it, and in the process, free radicals are generated. And so that results in damage in the liver. A chemical that can cause free radical or a classic chemical that can become a free radical is carbon tetrachloride. And carbon tetrachloride I'm going to discuss in much more detail in a moment because it lends to a high yield principle that shows up on exams. So let's put that one aside for a moment and we'll discuss it again just